Section 49 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 49. Sherman's Campaign in Georgia. Siege of Atlanta. Death of General McPherson. Attempt to capture Andersonville. Capture of Atlanta. After separating from Sherman in Cincinnati, I went on to Washington as already stated, while he returned to Nashville to assume the duties of his new command. His military division was now composed of 4 departments and embraced all the territory west of the Alleghany Mountains and east of the Mississippi River, together with the State of Arkansas in the Trans-Mississippi. The most easterly of these was the Department of the Ohio, General Schofield commanding. The next was the Department of the Cumberland, General Thomas commanding. The third, the Department of the Tennessee, General McPherson commanding, and General Steele still commanded the Trans-Mississippi or Department of Arkansas. The last named department was so far away that Sherman could not communicate with it very readily after starting on his spring campaign, and it was, therefore, soon transferred from his military division to that of the Gulf, where General Canby, who had relieved General Banks, was in command. The movements of the armies, as I have stated in a former chapter, were to be simultaneous, I fixing the day to start when the season should be far enough advanced, it was hoped, for the roads to be in a condition for the troops to march. General Sherman at once set himself to work preparing for the task which was assigned him to accomplish in the spring campaign. McPherson lay at Huntsville with about 24,000 men, guarding those points of Tennessee which were regarded as most worth holding. Thomas, with over 60,000 men of the Army of the Cumberland, was at Chattanooga, and Schofield, with about 14,000 men, was at Knoxville. With these 3 armies, numbering about 100,000 men in all, Sherman was to move on the day fixed for the general advance, with a view of destroying Johnston's army and capturing Atlanta. He visited each of these commands to inform himself as to their condition, and it was found to be, speaking generally, good. One of the first matters to turn his attention to was that of getting, before the time arrived for starting, an accumulation of supplies forward to Chattanooga, sufficiently large to warrant a movement. He found, when he got to that place, that the trains over the single track railroad, which was frequently interrupted for a day or 2 at a time, were only sufficient to meet the daily wants of the troops without bringing forward any surplus of any kind. He found, however, that trains were being used to transport all the beef cattle, horses for the cavalry, and even teams that were being brought to the front. He at once changed all this, and required beef cattle, teams, cavalry horses, and everything that could travel, even the troops, to be marched, and used the road exclusively for transporting supplies. In this way he was able to accumulate an abundance before the time finally fixed upon for the move, the 4th of May. As I have said already, Johnston was at Dalton, which was nearly 1/4 of the way between Chattanooga and Atlanta. The country is mountainous all the way to Atlanta, abounding in mountain streams, some of them of considerable volume. Dalton is on ground where water drains towards Atlanta and into one of the main streams rising northeast from there and flowing southwest, this being the general direction which all the main streams of that section take, with smaller tributaries entering into them. Johnston had been preparing himself for this campaign during the entire winter. The best positions for defense had been selected all the way from Dalton back to Atlanta, and very strongly intrenched, so that, as he might be forced to fall back from one position, he would have another to fall into in his rear. His position at Dalton was so very strongly intrenched that no doubt he expected, or at least hoped, to hold Sherman there and prevent him from getting any further. With a less skillful general, and one disposed to take no risks, I have no doubt that he would have succeeded. Sherman's plan was to start Schofield, who was farthest back, a few days in advance from Knoxville, having him move on the direct road to Dalton. Thomas was to move out to Ringgold. It had been Sherman's intention to cross McPherson over the Tennessee River at Huntsville or Decatur, and move him south from there, so as to have him come into the road running from Chattanooga to Atlanta, a good distance to the rear of the point Johnston was occupying. But when that was contemplated, it was hoped that McPherson alone would have troops enough to cope with Johnston, if the latter should move against him while unsupported by the balance of the army. In this he was disappointed. Two of McPherson's veteran divisions had reenlisted on the express provision that they were to have a furlough. This furlough had not yet expired, and they were not back. Then again, Sherman had lent Banks two divisions under A.J. Smith the winter before to cooperate with the trans-Mississippi forces, and this with the express pledge that they should be back by a time specified, so as to be prepared for this very campaign. It is hardly necessary to say they were not returned. That department continued to absorb troops to no purpose to the end of the war. This left McPherson so weak that the part of the plan above indicated had to be changed. He was therefore brought up to Chattanooga, and moved from there on a road to the right of Thomas, the two coming together about Dalton. The three armies were abreast, all ready to start promptly on time. Sherman soon found that Dalton was so strongly fortified that it was useless to make any attempt to carry it by assault, and even to carry it by regular approaches was impracticable. There was a narrowing up in the mountain, between the National and Confederate armies, through which a stream, a wagon road, and a railroad ran. Besides, the stream had been dammed so that the valley was a lake. Through this gorge the troops would have to pass. McPherson was therefore sent around by the right to come out by the way of Snake Creek Gap into the rear of the enemy. This was a surprise to Johnston, and about the 13th he decided to abandon his position at Dalton. On the 15th there was very hard fighting about Resaca. But our cavalry, having been sent around to the right, got near the road in the enemy's rear. Again Johnston fell back, our army pursuing. The pursuit was continued to Kingston, which was reached on the 19th with very little fighting, except that Newton's division overtook the rear of Johnston's army and engaged it. Sherman was now obliged to halt for the purpose of bringing up his railroad trains. He was depending upon the railroad for all of his supplies, and as of course the railroad was wholly destroyed as Johnston fell back, it had to be rebuilt. This work was pushed forward night and day, and caused much less delay than most persons would naturally expect in a mountainous country where there were so many bridges to be rebuilt. The campaign to Atlanta was managed with the most consummate skill. the enemy being flanked out of one position after another all the way there. It is true this was not accomplished without a good deal of fighting, some of it very hard fighting, rising to the dignity of very important battles. Neither were single positions gained in a day. On the contrary, weeks were spent at some, and about Atlanta more than a month was consumed. It was the 23d of May before the road was finished up to the rear of Sherman's army and the pursuit renewed. This pursuit brought him up to the vicinity of Allatoona. This place was very strongly intrenched, and naturally a very defensible position. An assault upon it was not thought of, but preparations were made to flank the enemy out of it. This was done by sending a large force around our right by the way of Dallas to reach the rear of the enemy. Before reaching there, however, they found the enemy fortified in their way, and there resulted hard fighting for about a week at a place called New Hope Church. On the left our troops also were fortified, and as close up to the enemy as they could get. They kept working still farther around to the left toward the railroad. This was the case more particularly with the cavalry. By the 4th of June Johnston found that he was being hemmed in so rapidly that he drew off, and Allatoona was left in our possession. Allatoona, being an important place, was strongly intrenched for occupation by our troops before advancing farther, and made a secondary base of supplies. The railroad was finished up to that point, the intrenchments completed, storehouses provided for food, and the army got in readiness for a farther advance. The rains, however, were falling in such torrents that it was impossible to move the army by the side roads which they would have to move upon in order to turn Johnston out of his new position. While Sherman's army lay here, General F. P. Blair returned to it, bringing with him the 2 divisions of veterans who had been on furlough. Johnston had fallen back to Marietta and Kennesaw Mountain, where strong intrenchments awaited him. At this latter place our troops made an assault upon the enemy's lines after having got their own lines up close to him, and failed, sustaining considerable loss. But during the progress of the battle Schofield was gaining ground to the left, and the cavalry on his left were gaining still more toward the enemy's rear. These operations were completed by the 3d of July, when it was found that Johnston had evacuated the place. He was pursued at once. Sherman had made every preparation to abandon the railroad, leaving a strong guard in his intrenchments. He had intended moving out with 20 days' rations and plenty of ammunition to come in on the railroad again at the Chattahoochee River. Johnston frustrated this plan by himself starting back as above stated. This time he fell back to the Chattahoochee. About the 5th of July he was besieged again, Sherman getting easy possession of the Chattahoochee River both above and below him. The enemy was again flanked out of his position, or so frightened by flanking movements that on the night of the 9th he fell back across the river. Here Johnston made a stand until the 17th, when Sherman's old tactics prevailed again and the final movement toward Atlanta began. Johnston was now relieved of the command, and Hood superseded him. Johnston's tactics in this campaign do not seem to have met with much favor, either in the eyes of the administration at Richmond or of the people of that section of the South in which he was commanding. The very fact of a change of commanders being ordered under such circumstances was an indication of a change of policy, and that now they would become the aggressors, the very thing our troops wanted. For my own part, I think that Johnston's tactics were right. Anything that could have prolonged the war a year beyond the time that it did finally close would probably have exhausted the North to such an extent that they might then have abandoned the contest and agreed to a separation. Atlanta was very strongly intrenched all the way around in a circle about 1.5 miles outside of the city. In addition to this, there were advanced intrenchments, which had to be taken before a close siege could be commenced. Sure enough, as indicated by the change of commanders, the enemy was about to assume the offensive. On the 20th he came out and attacked the Army of the Cumberland most furiously. Hooker's corps and Newton's and Johnson's divisions were the principal ones engaged in this contest, which lasted more than an hour. But the Confederates were then forced to fall back inside their main lines. The losses were quite heavy on both sides. On this day General Gresham, since our Postmaster General, was very badly wounded. During the night Hood abandoned his outer lines, and our troops were advanced. The investment had not been relinquished for a moment during the day. During the night of the 21st Hood moved out again, passing by our left flank, which was then in motion to get a position further in rear of him, and a desperate battle ensued, which lasted most of the day of the 22d. At first the battle went very much in favor of the Confederates, our troops being somewhat surprised. While our troops were advancing, they were struck in flank and their flank was enveloped. But they had become too thorough veterans to be thrown into irreparable confusion by an unexpected attack when off their guard, and soon they were in order and engaging the enemy, with the advantage now of knowing where their antagonist was. The field of battle continued to expand until it embraced about 7 miles of ground. Finally, however, and before night, the enemy was driven back into the city. It was during this battle that McPherson, while passing from one column to another, was instantly killed. In his death the army lost one of its ablest, purest, and best generals. Garrard had been sent out with his cavalry to get upon the railroad east of Atlanta and to cut it in the direction of Augusta. He was successful in this, and returned about the time of the battle. Rousseau had also come up from Tennessee with a small division of cavalry, having crossed the Tennessee River about Decatur, and made a raid into Alabama. Finally, when hard pressed, he had come in, striking the railroad in rear of Sherman, and reported to him about this time. The battle of the 22d is usually known as the Battle of Atlanta, although the city did not fall into our hands until the 2d of September. Preparations went on, as before, to flank the enemy out of his position. The work was tedious, and the lines that had to be maintained were very long. Our troops were gradually worked around to the east until they struck the road between Decatur and Atlanta. These lines were strongly fortified, as were those to the north and west of the city, all as close up to the enemy's lines as practicable, in order to hold them with the smallest possible number of men, the design being to detach an army to move by our right and try to get upon the railroad down south of Atlanta. On the 27th the movement by the right flank commenced. On the 28th the enemy struck our right flank, General Logan commanding, with great vigor. Logan intrenched himself hastily, and by that means was enabled to resist all assaults and inflict a great deal of damage upon the enemy. These assaults were continued to the middle of the afternoon, and resumed once or twice still later in the day. The enemy's losses in these unsuccessful assaults were fearful. During that evening the enemy in Logan's front withdrew into the town. This now left Sherman's army close up to the Confederate lines, extending from a point directly east of the city, around by the north and west of it for a distance of fully 10 miles, the whole of this line being intrenched and made stronger every day they remained there. In the latter part of July Sherman sent Stoneman to destroy the railroads to the south about Macon. He was then to go east and, if possible, release our prisoners about Andersonville. There were painful stories current at the time about the great hardships these prisoners had to endure in the way of general bad treatment, in the way in which they were housed, and in the way in which they were fed. Great sympathy was felt for them, and it was thought that even if they could be turned loose upon the country it would be a great relief to them. But the attempt proved a failure. McCook, who commanded a small brigade, was first reported to have been captured, but he got back, having inflicted a good deal of damage upon the enemy. He had also taken some prisoners, but, encountering afterwards a largely superior force of the enemy, he was obliged to drop his prisoners and get back as best he could with what men he had left. He had lost several hundred men out of his small command. On the 4th of August, Colonel Adams, commanding a little brigade of about 1,000 men, returned reporting Stoneman and all but himself as lost. I myself had heard around Richmond of the capture of Stoneman, and had sent Sherman word, which he received. The rumor was confirmed there also from other sources. A few days after Colonel Adams's return, Colonel Capron also got in with a small detachment and confirmed the report of the capture of Stoneman with something less than 1,000 men. It seems that Stoneman, finding the escape of all his force was impossible, had made arrangements for the escape of 2 divisions. He covered the movement of these divisions to the rear with a force of about 700 men, and at length surrendered himself and his detachment to the commanding Confederate. In this raid, however, much damage was inflicted upon the enemy by the destruction of cars, locomotives, army wagons, manufactories of military supplies, etc. On the 4th and 5th Sherman endeavored to get upon the railroad to our right, where Schofield was in command, but these attempts failed utterly. General Palmer was charged with being the cause of this failure to a great extent by both General Sherman and General Schofield. But I am not prepared to say this, although a question seems to have arisen with Palmer as to whether Schofield had any right to command him. If he did raise this question while an action was going on, that act alone was exceedingly reprehensible. About the same time Wheeler got upon our railroad north of Resaca and destroyed it nearly up to Dalton. This cut Sherman off from communication with the North for several days. Sherman responded to this attack on his lines of communication by directing one upon theirs. Kilpatrick started on the night of the 18th of August to reach the Macon road about Jonesboro. He succeeded in doing so, passed entirely around the Confederate lines of Atlanta, and was back again in his former position on our left by the 22d. These little affairs, however, contributed but very little to the grand result. They annoyed, it is true, but any damage thus done to a railroad by any cavalry expedition is soon repaired. Sherman made preparations for a repetition of his tactics, that is, for a flank movement with as large a force as could be got together to some point in the enemy's rear. Sherman commenced this last movement on the 25th of August, and on the 1st of September was well up towards the railroad 20 miles south of Atlanta. Here he found Hardee entrenched, ready to meet him. A battle ensued, but he was unable to drive Hardee away before night set in. Under cover of the night, however, Hardee left of his own accord. That night Hood blew up his military works, such as he thought would be valuable in our hands, and decamped. The next morning at daylight, General H. W. Slocum, who was commanding north of the city, moved in and took possession of Atlanta and notified Sherman. Sherman then moved deliberately back, taking 3 days to reach the city, and occupied a line extending from Decatur on the left to Atlanta in the centre, with his troops extending out of the city for some distance to the right. The campaign had lasted about 4 months, and was one of the most memorable in history. There was but little, if anything, in the whole campaign, now that it is over, to criticize at all, and nothing to criticize severely. It was creditable alike to the general who commanded and the army which had executed it. Sherman had on this campaign some bright, wide awake division and brigade commanders, whose alertness added a host to the efficiency of his command. The troops now went to work to make themselves comfortable and to enjoy a little rest after their arduous campaign. The city of Atlanta was turned into a military base. The citizens were all compelled to leave. Sherman also very wisely prohibited the assembling of the army of sutlers and traders, who always follow in the wake of an army in the field, if permitted to do so, from trading with the citizens and getting the money of the soldiers for articles of but little use to them, and for which they are made to pay most exorbitant prices. He limited the number of these traders to 1 for each of his 3 armies. The news of Sherman's success reached the North instantaneously, and set the country all aglow. This was the first great political campaign for the Republicans in their canvass of 1864. It was followed later by Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, and these 2 campaigns probably had more effect in settling the election of the following November than all the speeches, all the bonfires, and all the parading with banners and bands of music in the North. End of Section 49. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant, Chapter 50. Grand Movement of the Army of the Potomac, Crossing the Rapidan, Entering the Wilderness, Battle of the Wilderness. Soon after midnight, May 3d, 4th, the Army of the Potomac moved out from its position, North Rapidan, to start upon that memorable campaign, destined to result in the capture of the Confederate capital and the army defending it. This was not to be accomplished, however, without as desperate fighting as the world has ever witnessed. Not to be consummated in a day, a week, a month, single season. The losses inflicted and endured were destined to be severe, But the armies now confronting each other had already been in deadly conflict for a period of 3 years, with immense losses in killed, by death from sickness, captured and wounded, and neither had made any real progress accomplishing the final end. It is true, the Confederates had, so far, held their capital, and they claimed this to be their sole object. But previously they had boldly proclaimed their intention to capture Philadelphia, New York, and the national capital, and had made several attempts to do so, and once or twice had come fearfully near making their boast good, too near for complacent contemplation by the loyal North. They had also come near losing their own capital on at least one occasion, so here was a standoff. The campaign now begun was destined to result in heavier losses to both armies in a given time than any previously suffered, but the carnage was to be limited to a single year, and to accomplish all that had been anticipated or desired at the beginning in that time. We had to have hard fighting to achieve this. The two armies had been confronting each other so long, without any decisive result, that they hardly knew which could whip. 10 days' rations, with a supply of forage and ammunition, were taken in wagons. Beef cattle were driven with the trains and butchered as wanted. 3 days' rations, in addition, in haversacks, and 50 rounds of cartridges were carried on the person of each soldier. The country over which the army had to operate, from the Rapidan to the crossing of the James River, is rather flat, and is cut by numerous streams which make their way to the Chesapeake Bay. The crossings of these streams by the army were generally made not far above tide water, and where they formed a considerable obstacle to the rapid advance of troops even when the enemy did not appear in opposition. The country roads were narrow and poor. Most of the country is covered with a dense forest, in places, like the Wilderness and along the Chickahominy, almost impenetrable even for infantry, except along the roads. All bridges were naturally destroyed before the national troops came to them. The Army of the Potomac was composed of 3 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, commanded respectively by Generals W. S. Hancock, G. K. Warren, John Sedgwick, and P. H. Sheridan. The artillery was commanded by General Henry J. Hunt. This arm was in such abundance that the fourth of it could not be used to advantage in such a country as we were destined to pass through. The surplus was much in the way, taking up, as it did, so much of the narrow and bad roads, and consuming so much of the forage and other stores brought up by the trains. The 5th Corps, General Warren commanding, was in advance on the right and marched directly for Germania Ford, preceded by 1 division of cavalry under General J. H. Wilson. General Sedgwick followed Warren with the 6th Corps. Germania Ford was 9 or 10 miles below the right of Lee's line. Hancock, with the 2d Corps, moved by another road further east, directly upon Ely's Ford, 6 miles below Germania, preceded by Gregg's division of cavalry and followed by the artillery. Torbert's division of cavalry was left north of the Rapidan for the time to picket the river and prevent the enemy from crossing and getting into our rear. The cavalry seized the two crossings before daylight, drove the enemy's pickets guarding them away, and by 6 o'clock A.M. had the pontoons laid ready for the crossing of the infantry and artillery. This was undoubtedly a surprise to Lee. The fact that the movement was unopposed proves this. Burnside, with the 9th Corps, was left back at Warrenton, guarding the railroad from Bull Run forward to preserve control of it in case our crossing the Rapidan should be long delayed. He was instructed, however, to advance at once on receiving notice that the army had crossed, and a dispatch was sent to him a little after 1 P.M. giving the information that our crossing had been successful. The country was heavily wooded at all the points of crossing, particularly on the south side of the river. The battlefield, from the crossing of the Rapidan until the final movement from the Wilderness toward Spotsylvania, was of the same character. There were some clearings and small farms within what might be termed the battlefield, but generally the country was covered with a dense forest. The roads were narrow and bad. All the conditions were favorable for defensive operations. There are two roads, good for that part of Virginia, running from Orange Court House to the battlefield. The most southerly of these roads is known as the Orange Court House Plank Road, the northern one as the Orange Turnpike. There are also roads from east of the battlefield running to Spotsylvania Courthouse, one from Chancellorsville branching at Aldrich's, the western branch going by Piney Branch Church, Allsop's, thence by the Brock Road to Spotsylvania. The east branch goes by Gates's, thence to Spotsylvania. The Brock Road runs from Germania Ford through the battlefield and on to the courthouse. As Spotsylvania is approached, the country is cut up with numerous roads, some going to the town direct, and others crossing so as to connect the farms with roads going there. Lee's headquarters were at Orange Courthouse. From there to Fredericksburg he had the use of the two roads above described, running nearly parallel to the Wilderness. This gave him unusual facilities for that country for concentrating his forces to his right. These roads strike the road from Germania Ford in the Wilderness. As soon as the crossing of the infantry was assured, the cavalry pushed forward. Wilson's division by Wilderness Tavern to Parker's Store on the Orange Plank Road, Gregg to the left towards Chancellorsville. Warren followed Wilson and reached the Wilderness Tavern by noon, took position there, and entrenched. Sedgwick followed Warren. He was across the river and in camp on the south bank on the right of Warren by sundown. Hancock, with the 2d Corps, moved parallel with Warren and camped about 6 miles east of him. Before night all the troops, and by the evening of the 5th the trains of more than 4,000 wagons, were safely on the south side of the river. There never was a corps better organized than was the Quartermaster Corps with the Army of the Potomac in 1864. With a wagon train that would have extended from the Rapidan to Richmond, stretched along in single file and separated as the teams necessarily would be when moving, we could still carry only 3 days' forage and about 10 to 12 days' rations, besides a supply of ammunition. To overcome all difficulties, the chief quartermaster, General Rufus Ingalls, had marked on each wagon the corps badge with the division color and the number of the brigade. At a glance, the particular brigade to which any wagon belonged could be told. The wagons were also marked to note the contents, if ammunition, whether for artillery or infantry; if forage, whether grain or hay; if rations, whether bread, pork, beans, rice, sugar, coffee, or whatever it might be. Empty wagons were never allowed to follow the army or stay in camp. As soon as a wagon was empty, it would return to the base of supply for a load of precisely the same article that had been taken from it. Empty trains were obliged to leave the road free for loaded ones. Arriving near the army, they would be parked in fields nearest to the brigades they belonged to. Issues, except of ammunition, were made at night in all cases. By this system the hauling of forage for the supply train was almost wholly dispensed with. They consumed theirs at the depots. I left Culpeper Court House after all the troops had been put in motion, and passing rapidly to the front, crossed the Rapidan in advance of Sedgwick's corps, and established headquarters for the afternoon and night in a deserted house near the river. Orders had been given, long before this movement began, to cut down the baggage of officers and men to the lowest point possible. Notwithstanding this, I saw scattered along the road from Culpeper to Germania Ford wagon loads of new blankets and overcoats, thrown away by the troops to lighten their knapsacks, an improvidence I had never witnessed before. Lee, while his pickets and signal corps must have discovered at a very early hour on the morning of the 4th of May that the Army of the Potomac was moving, evidently did not learn until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon by what route we would confront his army. This I judge from the fact that at 1:15 P.M., an hour and a quarter after Warren had reached Old Wilderness Tavern, our officers took off rebel signals which, when translated, were seen to be an order to his troops to occupy their intrenchments at Mine Run. Here at night dispatches were received announcing that Sherman, Butler, and Crook had moved according to programme. On discovering the advance of the Army of the Potomac, Lee ordered Hill, Ewell, and Longstreet, each commanding corps, to move to the right to attack us. Hill on the Orange Plank Road, Longstreet to follow on the same road. Longstreet was at this time, middle of the afternoon, at Gordonsville, 20 or more miles away. Ewell was ordered by the Orange Pike. He was nearby and arrived some 4 miles east of Mine Run before bivouacking for the night. My orders were given through General Meade for an early advance on the morning of the 5th. Warren was to move to Parker's Store, and Wilson's cavalry, then at Parker's Store, to move on to Craig's Meeting House. Sedgwick followed Warren, closing in on his right. The Army of the Potomac was facing to the west, though our advance was made to the south, except when facing the enemy. Hancock was to move southwestward to join on the left of Warren, his left to reach to Shady Grove Church. At 6 o'clock, before reaching Parker's Store, Warren discovered the enemy. He sent word back to this effect, and was ordered to halt and prepare to meet and attack him. Wright, with his division of Sedgwick's corps, was ordered, by any road he could find, to join on to Warren's right, and Getty, with his division, also of Sedgwick's corps, was ordered to move rapidly by Warren's rear and get on his left. This was the speediest way to reinforce Warren, who was confronting the enemy on both the Orange Plank and Turnpike roads. Burnside had moved promptly on the 4th, on receiving word that the Army of the Potomac had safely crossed the Rapidan. By making a night march, although some of his troops had to march 40 miles to reach the river, he was crossing with the head of his column early on the morning of the 5th. Meade moved his headquarters on to Old Wilderness Tavern, 4 miles south of the river, as soon as it was light enough to see the road. I remained to hasten Burnside's crossing and to put him in position. Burnside at this time was not under Meade's command, and was his senior in rank. Getting information of the proximity of the enemy, I informed Meade, and without waiting to see Burnside, at once moved forward my headquarters to where Meade was. It was my plan then, as it was on all other occasions, to take the initiative whenever the enemy could be drawn from his intrenchments, if we were not entrenched ourselves. Warren had not yet reached the point where he was to halt, when he discovered the enemy near by. Neither party had any advantage of position. Warren was, therefore, ordered to attack as soon as he could prepare for it. At 9 o'clock Hancock was ordered to come up to the support of Getty. He himself arrived at Getty's front about noon, but his troops were yet far in the rear. Getty was directed to hold his position at all hazards until relieved. About this hour Warren was ready, and attacked with favorable, though not decisive, results. Getty was somewhat isolated from Warren, and was in a precarious condition for a time. Wilson, with his division of cavalry, was farther south and was cut off from the rest of the army. At 2 o'clock Hancock's troops began to arrive, and immediately he was ordered to join Getty and attack the enemy. But the heavy timber and narrow roads prevented him from getting into position for attack as promptly as he generally did when receiving such orders. At 4 o'clock he again received his orders to attack, and General Getty received orders from Meade a few minutes later to attack, whether Hancock was ready or not. He met the enemy under Heth within a few hundred yards. Hancock immediately sent 2 divisions, commanded by Birney and Mott, and later 2 brigades, Carroll's and Owens', to the support of Getty. This was timely and saved Getty. During the battle Getty and Carroll were wounded, but remained on the field. One of Birney's most gallant brigade commanders, Alexander Hayes, was killed. I had been at West Point with Hayes for 3 years, and had served with him through the Mexican War, a portion of the time in the same regiment. He was a most gallant officer, ready to lead his command wherever ordered. With him it was "Come, boys," not "Go." Wadsworth's division and Baxter's brigade of the 2d division were sent to reinforce Hancock and Getty, but the density of the intervening forest was such that, there being no road to march upon, they did not get up with the head of column until night, and bivouacked where they were without getting into position. During the afternoon Sheridan sent Gregg's division of cavalry to Todd's Tavern in search of Wilson. This was fortunate. He found Wilson engaged with a superior force under General Rosser, supported by infantry, and falling back before it. Together they were strong enough to turn the tables upon the enemy and themselves become aggressive. They soon drove the rebel cavalry back beyond Corbin's Bridge. Fighting between Hancock and Hill continued until night put a close to it. Neither side made any special progress. After the close of the battle of the 5th of May, my orders were given for the following morning. We knew Longstreet with 12,000 men was on his way to join Hill's right, near the Brock Road, and might arrive during the night. I was anxious that the rebels should not take the initiative in the morning, and therefore ordered Hancock to make an assault at 4:30 o'clock. Meade asked to have the hour changed to 6. Deferring to his wishes as far as I was willing, the order was modified and 5 was fixed as the hour to move. Hancock had now fully one half of the Army of the Potomac. Wadsworth, with his division, which had arrived the night before, lay in a line perpendicular to that held by Hill and to the right of Hancock. He was directed to move at the same time and to attack Hill's left. Burnside, who was coming up with 2 divisions, was directed to get in between Warren and Wadsworth and attack as soon as he could get in position to do so. Sedgwick and Warren were to make attacks in their front, to detain as many of the enemy as they could, and to take advantage of any attempt to reinforce Hill from that quarter. Burnside was ordered, if he should succeed in breaking the enemy's centre, to swing around to the left and envelop the right of Lee's army. Hancock was informed of all the movements ordered. Burnside had 3 divisions, but one of them, a colored division, was sent to guard the wagon train, and he did not see it again until July. Lee was evidently very anxious that there should be no battle on his right until Longstreet got up. This is evident from the fact that, notwithstanding the early hour at which I had ordered the assault, both for the purpose of being the attacking party and to strike before Longstreet got up, Lee was ahead in his assault on our right. His purpose was evident, but he failed. Hancock was ready to advance by the hour named, but learning in time that Longstreet was moving a part of his corps by the Catharpin Road, thus threatening his left flank, sent a division of infantry, commanded by General Barlow, with all his artillery, to cover the approaches by which Longstreet was expected. This disposition was made in time to attack as ordered. Hancock moved by the left of the Orange Plank Road, and Wadsworth by the right of it. The fighting was desperate for about an hour, when the enemy began to break up in great confusion. I believed then, and see no reason to change that opinion now, that if the country had been such that Hancock and his command could have seen the confusion and panic in the lines of the enemy, it would have been taken advantage of so effectually that Lee would not have made another stand outside of his Richmond defenses. Gibbon commanded Hancock's left and was ordered to attack, but was not able to accomplish much. On the morning of the 6th, Sheridan was sent to connect with Hancock's left and attack the enemy's cavalry who were trying to get on our left and rear. He met them at the intersection of the Furnace and Brock roads and at Todd's Tavern, and defeated them at both places. Later he was attacked, and again the enemy was repulsed. Hancock heard the firing between Sheridan and Stuart, and thinking the enemy coming by that road, still further reinforced his position guarding the entrance to the Brock road. Another incident happened during the day to further induce Hancock to weaken his attacking column. Word reached him that troops were seen moving towards him from the direction of Todd's Tavern, and Brooks's brigade was detached to meet this new enemy. But the troops approaching proved to be several hundred convalescents coming from Chancellorsville by the road Hancock had advanced upon, to join their respective commands. At 6:50 A.M. Burnside, who had passed Wilderness Tavern at 6 o'clock, was ordered to send a division to the support of Hancock, but to continue with the remainder of his command in the execution of his previous order. The difficulty of making a way through the dense forests prevented Burnside from getting up in time to be of any service on the forenoon of the 6th. Hancock followed Hill's retreating forces in the morning, a mile or more. He maintained this position until, along in the afternoon, Longstreet came upon him. The retreating column of Hill, meeting reinforcements that had not yet been engaged, became encouraged and returned with them. They were enabled, from the density of the forest, to approach within a few hundred yards of our advance before being discovered. Falling upon a brigade of Hancock's corps thrown to the advance, they swept it away almost instantly. The enemy followed up his advantage and soon came upon Mott's division, which fell back in great confusion. Hancock made dispositions to hold his advanced position, but after holding it for a time, fell back into the position that he had held in the morning, which was strongly entrenched. In this engagement the intrepid Wadsworth, while trying to rally his men, was mortally wounded, and fell into the hands of the enemy. The enemy followed up, but made no immediate attack. The Confederate General Jenkins was killed and Longstreet seriously wounded in this engagement. Longstreet had to leave the field, not to resume command for many weeks. His loss was a severe one to Lee, and compensated in a great measure for the mishap or misapprehensions which had fallen to our lot during the day. After Longstreet's removal from the field, Lee took command of his right in person. He was not able, however, to rally his men to attack Hancock's position, and withdrew from our front for the purpose of reforming. Hancock sent a brigade to clear his front of all remnants that might be left of Longstreet's or Hill's commands. This brigade, having been formed at right angles to the intrenchments held by Hancock's command, swept down the whole length of them from left to right. A brigade of the enemy was encountered in this move, but it broke and disappeared without a contest. Firing was continued after this, but with less fury. Burnside had not yet been able to get up to render any assistance, but it was now only about 9 in the morning, and he was getting into position on Hancock's right. At 4:15 in the afternoon Lee attacked our left. His line moved up to within 100 yards of ours and opened a heavy fire. This status was maintained for about half an hour. Then a part of Mott's division and Ward's brigade of Birney's division gave way and retired in disorder. The enemy, under R. H. Anderson, took advantage of this and pushed through our line, planting their flags on a part of the intrenchments not on fire, but owing to the efforts of Hancock their success was but temporary. Carroll, of Gibbon's division moved at a double quick with his brigade and drove back the enemy, inflicting great loss. Fighting had continued from 5 in the morning, sometimes along the whole line, at other times only in places. The ground fought over had varied in width, but averaged 3/4 of a mile. The killed and many of the severely wounded of both armies lay within this belt, where it was impossible to reach them. The woods were set on fire by the bursting shells, and the conflagration raged. The wounded, who had not strength to move themselves, were either suffocated or burned to death. Finally the fire communicated with our breastworks in places. Being constructed of wood, they burned with great fury. But the battle still raged, our men firing through the flames until it became too hot to remain longer. Lee was now in distress. His men were in confusion, and his personal efforts failed to restore order. These facts, however, were learned subsequently, or we would have taken advantage of his condition and no doubt gained a decisive success. His troops were withdrawn now, but I revoked the order which I had given previously to this assault for Hancock to attack, because his troops had exhausted their ammunition and did not have time to replenish from the train, which was at some distance. Burnside, Sedgwick and Warren had all kept up an assault during all this time, but their efforts had no more effect than to prevent the enemy from reinforcing his right from the troops in their front. I had, on the 5th, ordered all the bridges over the Rapidan to be taken up except one at Germania Ford. The troops on Sedgwick's right had been sent to enforce our left. This left our right in danger of being turned and us of being cut off from all present base of supplies. Sedgwick had refused his right and entrenched it for protection against attack. But late in the afternoon of the 6th, Early came out from his lines in considerable force and got in upon Sedgwick's right, notwithstanding the precautions taken, and created considerable confusion. Early captured several hundred prisoners, among them 2 general officers. The defense, however, was vigorous, and night coming on, the enemy was thrown into as much confusion as our troops engaged were. Early says in his Memoirs that if we had discovered the confusion in his lines we might have brought fresh troops to his great discomfort. Many officers who had not been attacked by Early continued coming to my headquarters even after Sedgwick had rectified his lines a little farther to the rear, with news of the disaster, fully impressed with the idea that the enemy was pushing on and would soon be upon me. During the night all of Lee's army withdrew within their intrenchments. On the morning of the 7th General Custer drove the enemy's cavalry from Catharpin Furnace to Todd's Tavern. Pickets and skirmishers were sent along our entire front to find the position of the enemy. Some went as far as 1.5 miles before finding him, but Lee showed no disposition to come out of his works. There was no battle during the day, and but little firing except in Warren's front, he being directed about noon to make a reconnoissance in force. This drew some sharp firing, but there was no attempt on the part of Lee to drive him back. This ended the Battle of the Wilderness. End of section 50. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com. #51 of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant, Chapter 51. After the battle, telegraph and signal service, movement by the left flank. More desperate fighting has not been witnessed on this continent than that of the 5th and 6th of May. Our victory consisted in having successfully crossed a formidable stream, almost in the face of an enemy, and in getting the army together as a unit. We gained an advantage on the morning of the 6th which, if it had been followed up, must have proven very decisive. In the evening the enemy gained an advantage, but was speedily repulsed. As we stood at the close, the two armies were relatively in about the same condition to meet each other as when the river divided them, but the fact of having safely crossed was a victory. Our losses in the Wilderness were very severe. Those of the Confederates must have been even more so, but I have no means of speaking with accuracy upon this point. The Germania Ford Bridge was transferred to Ely's Ford to facilitate the transportation of the wounded to Washington. It may be as well here as elsewhere to state two things connected with all movements of the Army of the Potomac. First, in every change of position or halt for the night, whether confronting the enemy or not, the moment arms were stacked, the men intrenched themselves. For this purpose they would build up piles of logs or rails, if they could be found in their front, and dig a ditch, throwing the dirt forward on the timber. Thus the digging they did counted in making a depression to stand in, and increased the elevation in front of them. It was wonderful how quickly they could in this way construct defenses of considerable strength. When a halt was made with the view of assaulting the enemy, or in his presence, these would be strengthened or their positions changed under the direction of engineer officers. The second was the use made of the telegraph and signal corps. Nothing could be more complete than the organization and discipline of this body of brave and intelligent men. Insulated wires, insulated so that they would transmit messages in a storm on the ground or under water, were wound upon reels, making about 200 pounds weight of wire to each reel. 2 men and 1 mule were detailed to each reel. The pack saddle on which this was carried was provided with a rack like a sawbuck, placed crosswise of the saddle, and raised above it so that the reel with its wire would revolve freely. There was a wagon supplied with a telegraph operator, battery, and telegraph instruments for each division, each corps, each army, and one for my headquarters. There were wagons also loaded with light poles, about the size and length of a wall tent pole, supplied with an iron spike in one end, used to hold the wires up when laid, so that wagons and artillery would not run over them. The mules thus loaded were assigned to brigades, and always kept with the command they were assigned to. The operators were also assigned to particular headquarters, and never changed except by special orders. The moment the troops were put in position to go into camp, all the men connected with this branch of service would proceed to put up their wires. A mule loaded with a coil of wire would be led to the rear of the nearest flank of the brigade he belonged to, and would be led in a line parallel thereto, while one man would hold an end of the wire and uncoil it as the mule was led off. When he had walked the length of the wire, the hold of it would be on the ground. This would be done in rear of every brigade at the same time. The ends of all the wires would then be joined, making a continuous wire in the rear of the whole army. The men attached to brigades or divisions would all commence at once raising the wires with their telegraph poles. This was done by making a loop in the wire and putting it over the spike and raising the pole to a perpendicular position. At intervals the wire would be attached to trees or some other permanent object so that one pole was sufficient at a place. In the absence of such a support, two poles would have to be used at intervals, placed at an angle so as to hold the wire firm in its place. While this was being done, the telegraph wagons would take their positions near where the headquarters they belonged to were to be established, and would connect with the wire. Thus, in a few minutes longer time than it took a mule to walk the length of its coil, telegraphic communication would be effected between all the headquarters of the army. No orders ever had to be given to establish the telegraph. The signal service was used on the march. The men composing this corps were assigned to specific commands. When movements were made, they would go in advance or on the flanks, and seize upon high points of ground giving a commanding view of the country if cleared, or would climb tall trees on the highest points if not cleared, and would denote by signals the positions of different parts of our own army, and often the movements of the enemy. They would also take off the signals of the enemy and transmit them. It would sometimes take too long a time to make translations of intercepted dispatches for us to receive any benefit from them, but sometimes they gave useful information. On the afternoon of the 7th, I received news from Washington announcing that Sherman had probably attacked Johnston that day, and that Butler had reached City Point safely and taken it by surprise on the 5th. I had given orders for a movement by the left flank, fearing that Lee might move rapidly to Richmond to crush Butler before I could get there. My order for this movement was as follows: Headquarters, Army of the United States, May 7, 1864, 6:30 A.M. Major General Meade, commanding Army of the Potomac. Make all preparations during the day for a night march to take position at Spotsylvania Court House, with one army corps at Todd's Tavern with one, and another near the intersection of the Piney Branch and Spotsylvania Road with the road from Alsop's to Old Court House. If this move is made, the trains should be thrown forward early in the morning to the Nye River. I think it would be advisable in making the change to leave Hancock where he is until Warren passes him. He could then follow and become the right of the new line. Burnside will move to Piney Branch Church. Sedgwick can move along the pike to Chancellorsville and on to his destination. Burnside will move on the Plank Road to the intersection of it with the Orange and Fredericksburg Plank Road, then follow Sedgwick to his place of destination. All vehicles should be got out of hearing of the enemy before the troops move, and then move off quietly. It is more than probable that the enemy concentrate for a heavy attack on Hancock this afternoon. In case they do, we must be prepared to resist them and follow up any success we may gain with our whole force. Such a result would necessarily modify these instructions. All the hospitals should be moved today to Chancellorsville. Ulysses S. Grant, Lieutenant General. During the 7th, Sheridan had a fight with the rebel cavalry at Todd's Tavern, but routed them, thus opening the way for the troops that were to go by that route at night. Soon after dark Warren withdrew from the front of the enemy and was soon followed by Sedgwick. Warren's march carried him immediately behind the works where Hancock's command lay on the Brock Road. With my staff and a small escort of cavalry I preceded the troops. Meade with his staff accompanied me. The greatest enthusiasm was manifested by Hancock's men as we passed by. No doubt it was inspired by the fact that the movement was south. It indicated to them that they had passed through the beginning of the end in the battle just fought. The cheering was so lusty that the enemy must have taken it for a night attack. At all events, it drew from him a furious fusillade of artillery and musketry, plainly heard but not felt by us. Meade and I rode in advance. We had passed but a little way beyond our left when the road forked. We looked to see, if we could, which road Sheridan had taken with his cavalry during the day. It seemed to be the right-hand one, and accordingly we took it. We had not gone far, however, when Colonel C. B. Comstock of my staff, with the instinct of the engineer, suspecting that we were on a road that would lead us into the lines of the enemy, if he, too, should be moving, dashed by at a rapid gallop and all alone. In a few minutes he returned and reported that Lee was moving, and that the road we were on would bring us into his lines in a short distance. We returned to the forks of the road, left a man to indicate the right road to the head of Warren's column when it should come up, and continued our journey to Todd's Tavern, where we arrived after midnight. My object in moving to Spotsylvania was twofold. First, I did not want Lee to get back to Richmond in time to attempt to crush Butler before I could get there. Second, I wanted to get between his army and Richmond if possible, and if not, to draw him into the open field. But Lee, by accident, beat us to Spotsylvania. Our wagon trains had been ordered easterly of the roads the troops were to march upon before the movement commenced. Lee interpreted this as a semi-retreat of the Army of the Potomac to Fredericksburg, and so informed his government. Accordingly he ordered Longstreet's corps, now commanded by Anderson, to move in the morning, the 8th, to Spotsylvania. But the woods being still on fire, Anderson could not go into bivouac, and marched directly on to his destination that night. By this accident Lee got possession of Spotsylvania. It is impossible to say now what would have been the result if Lee's orders had been obeyed as given, but it is certain that we would have been in Spotsylvania and between him and his capital. My belief is that there would have been a race between the two armies to see which could reach Richmond first, and the Army of the Potomac would have had the shorter line. Thus twice since crossing the Rapidan we came near closing the campaign, so far as battles were concerned, from the Rapidan to the James River or Richmond. The first failure was caused by our not following up the success gained over Hill's corps on the morning of the 6th, as before described. The second, when fires caused by that battle drove Anderson to make a march during the night of the 7th 8th, which he was ordered to commence on the morning of the 8th. But accident often decides the fate of battle. Sheridan's cavalry had had considerable fighting during the afternoon of the 7th, lasting at Todd's Tavern until after night, with the field his at the close. He issued the necessary orders for seizing Spotsylvania and holding the bridge over the Po River, which Lee's troops would have to cross to get to Spotsylvania. But Meade changed Sheridan's orders to Merritt, who was holding the bridge, on his arrival at Todd's Tavern, and thereby left the road free for Anderson when he came up. Wilson, who was ordered to seize the town, did so with his division of cavalry, but he could not hold it against the Confederate corps, which had not been detained at the crossing of the Po as it would have been but for the unfortunate change in Merritt's orders. Had he been permitted to execute the orders Sheridan gave him, he would have been guarding with 2 brigades of cavalry the bridge over the Po River, which Anderson had to cross, and must have detained him long enough to enable Warren to reinforce Wilson and hold the town. Anderson soon intrenched himself, if indeed the intrenchments were not already made, immediately across Warren's front. Warren was not aware of his presence, but probably supposed it was the cavalry which Merritt had engaged earlier in the day. He assaulted at once, but was repulsed. He soon organized his men, as they were not pursued by the enemy, and made a second attack, this time with his whole corps. This time he succeeded in gaining a position immediately in the enemy's front, where he entrenched his right and left divisions, the former Crawford's, the latter Wadsworth's, now commanded by Cutler, drove the enemy back some distance. At this time my headquarters had been advanced to Piney Branch Church. I was anxious to crush Anderson before Lee could get a force to his support. To this end Sedgwick, who was at Piney Branch Church, was ordered to Warren's support. Hancock, who was at Todd's Tavern, was notified of Warren's engagement and was directed to be in readiness to come up. Burnside, who was with the wagon trains at Aldrich's on our extreme left, received the same instructions. Sedgwick was slow in getting up for some reason, probably unavoidable, because he was never at fault when serious work was to be done, so that it was near night before the combined forces were ready to attack. Even then all of Sedgwick's command did not get into the engagement. Warren led the last assault, one division at a time, and of course it failed. Warren's difficulty was twofold. When he received an order to do anything, it would at once occur to his mind how all the balance of the army should be engaged so as properly to cooperate with him. His ideas were generally good, but he would forget that the person giving him orders had thought of others at the time he had of him. In like manner, when he did get ready to execute an order, after giving most intelligent instructions to division commanders, he would go in with one division, holding the others in reserve until he could superintend their movements in person also, forgetting that division commanders could execute an order without his presence. His difficulty was constitutional and beyond his control. He was an officer of superior ability, quick perceptions, and personal courage to accomplish anything that could be done with a small command. Lee had ordered Hill's corps, now commanded by Early, to move by the very road we had marched upon. This shows that even early in the morning of the 8th Lee had not yet become acquainted with my move, but still thought that the Army of the Potomac had gone to Fredericksburg. Indeed, he informed the authorities at Richmond he had possession of Spotsylvania and was on my flank. Anderson was in possession of Spotsylvania, through no foresight of Lee, however. Early only found that he had been following us when he ran against Hancock at Todd's Tavern. His coming detained Hancock from the battlefield of Spotsylvania for that day, but he, in like manner, kept Early back and forced him to move by another route. Had I ordered the movement for the night of the 7th by my left flank, it would have put Hancock in the lead. It would also have given us an hour or earlier start. It took all that time for Warren to get the head of his column to the left of Hancock after he had got his troops out of their line confronting the enemy. This hour, and Hancock's capacity to use his whole force when necessary, would, no doubt, have enabled him to crush Anderson before he could be reinforced. But the movement made was tactical. It kept the troops in mass against a possible assault by the enemy. Our left occupied its intrenchments while the two corps to the right passed. If an attack had been made by the enemy, he would have found the 2d Corps in position fortified, and practically the 5th and 6th Corps in position as reserves, until his entire front was passed. By a left flank movement the army would have been scattered while still passing the front of the enemy, and before the extreme right had got by it would have been very much exposed. Then, too, I had not yet learned the special qualifications of the different corps commanders. At that time my judgment was that Warren was the man I would suggest to succeed Meade should anything happen to that gallant soldier to take him from the field. As I have before said, Warren was a gallant soldier, an able man, and he was, beside, thoroughly imbued with the solemnity and importance of the duty he had to perform. End of section 51. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at jocclev.com. Of Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Clevenger. Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant by Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 52. Battle of Spotsylvania. Hancock's position. Assault of Warren's and Wright's corps. Upton promoted on the field. Good news from Butler and Sheridan. The Mattapony River is formed by the junction of the Mat, the Ta, the Po, and the Nye rivers, the last being the northernmost of the four. It takes its rise about a mile south and a little east of the Wilderness Tavern. The Po rises southwest of the place, but farther away. Spotsylvania is on the ridge dividing these two streams, and where they are but a few miles apart. The Brock Road reaches Spotsylvania without crossing either of these streams. Lee's army, coming up by the Catharpin Road, had to cross the Po at Wooden Bridge. Warren and Hancock came by the Brock Road. Sedgwick crossed the Nye at Catharpin Furnace. Burnside, coming by Aldrich's to Gates's house, had to cross the Nye near the enemy. He found pickets at the bridge, but they were soon driven off by a brigade of Wilcox's division, and the stream was crossed. The brigade was furiously attacked, but the remainder of the division coming up, they were enabled to hold their position and soon fortified it. About the time I received the news of this attack, word came from Hancock that Early had left his front. He had been forced over to the Catharpin Road, crossing the Po at Corbin's and again at Wooden Bridge. These are the bridges Sheridan had given orders to his cavalry to occupy on the 8th, while one division should occupy Spotsylvania. These movements of the enemy gave me the idea that Lee was about to make the attempt to get to or towards Fredericksburg, to cut off my supplies. I made arrangements to attack his right and get between him and Richmond if he should try to execute this design. If he had any such intention, it was abandoned as soon as Burnside was established south of the Ny. The Po and the Ny are narrow little streams, but deep, with abrupt banks, and bordered by heavily wooded and marshy bottoms at the time we were there, and difficult to cross except where bridged. The country about was generally heavily timbered, but with occasional clearings. It was a much better country to conduct a defensive campaign in than an offensive one. By noon of the 9th, the position of the two armies was as follows: Lee occupied a semicircle facing north, northwest, and northeast, enclosing the town. Anderson was on his left, extending to the Po. Ewell came next, then Early. Warren occupied our right, covering the Brock and other roads converging at Spotsylvania. Sedgwick was to his left, and Burnside on our extreme left. Hancock was yet back at Todd's Tavern, but as soon as it was known that Early had left Hancock's front, the latter was ordered up to Warren's right. He formed a line with 3 divisions on the hill overlooking the Po early in the afternoon, and was ordered to cross the Po and get on the enemy's flank. The 4th division of Hancock's corps, Mott commanding, was left at Todd's when the corps first came up, but in the afternoon it was brought up and placed to the left of Sedgwick's, now Wright's, 6th corps. In the morning General Sedgwick had been killed near the right of his intrenchments by rebel sharpshooters. His loss was a severe one to the Army of the Potomac and to the nation. General H. G. Wright succeeded him in the command of his corps. Hancock was now, 9 P.M. of the 9th of May, across the left flank of Lee's army, but separated from it and also from the remainder of Meade's army by the Po River. But for the lateness of the hour and the darkness of the night, he would have attempted to cross the river again at Wooden Bridge, thus bringing himself on the same side with both friend and foe. The Po, at the points where Hancock's corps crossed, runs nearly due east. Just below his lower crossing, the troops crossed at 3 points, it turns due south, and after passing under Wooden Bridge soon resumes a more easterly direction. During the night this corps built 3 bridges over the Po, but these were in rear. The position assumed by Hancock's corps forced Lee to reinforce his left during the night. Accordingly, on the morning of the 10th, when Hancock renewed his effort to get over the Po to his front, he found himself confronted by some of Early's command, which had been brought from the extreme right of the enemy during the night. He succeeded in effecting a crossing with 1 brigade, however, but finding the enemy entrenched in his front, no more were crossed. Hancock reconnoitred his front on the morning of the 10th, with the view of forcing a crossing if it was found that an advantage could be gained. The enemy was found strongly entrenched on the high ground overlooking the river, and commanding the Wooden Bridge with artillery. Anderson's left rested on the Po, where it turned south. Therefore, for Hancock to cross over, although it would bring him to the same side of the stream with the rest of the army, would still further isolate him from it. The stream would have to be crossed twice in the face of the enemy to unite with the main body. The idea of crossing was therefore abandoned. Lee had weakened the other parts of his line to meet this movement of Hancock's, and I determined to take advantage of it. Accordingly, in the morning, orders were issued for an attack in the afternoon on the centre by Warren's and Wright's corps, Hancock to command all the attacking force. Two of his divisions were brought to the north side of the Po. Gibbon was placed to the right of Warren, and Birney in his rear as a reserve. Barlow's division was left south of the stream, and Mott, of the same corps, was still to the left of Wright's corps. Burnside was ordered to reconnoitre his front in force, and if an opportunity presented, to attack with vigor. The enemy, seeing Barlow's division isolated from the rest of the army, came out and attacked with fury. Barlow repulsed the assault with great slaughter and with considerable loss to himself, but the enemy reorganized and renewed the assault. Birney was now moved to the high ground overlooking the river crossing built by our troops, and covered the crossings. The second assault was repulsed again with severe loss to the enemy, and Barlow was withdrawn without further molestation. General T.G. Stevenson was killed in this move. Between the lines, where Warren's assault was to take place, there was a ravine grown up with large trees and underbrush, making it almost impenetrable by man. The slopes on both sides were also covered with a heavy growth of timber. Warren, before noon, reconnoitred his front twice, the first time with one and the second with two divisions. He was repulsed on both occasions, but gained such information of the ground as to induce him to report recommending the assault. Wright also reconnoitred his front and gained a considerably advanced position from the one he started from. He then organized a storming party consisting of 12 regiments, and assigned Colonel Emory Upton, of the 121st New York Volunteers, to the command of it. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon the assault was ordered. Warren's and Wright's corps, with Mott's division of Hancock's corps, to move simultaneously. The movement was prompt, and in a few minutes the fiercest of struggles began. The battlefield was so densely covered with forest that but little could be seen by any one person as to the progress made. Meade and I occupied the best position we could get, in rear of Warren. Warren was repulsed with heavy loss, General J.C. Rice being among the killed. He was not followed, however, by the enemy, and was thereby enabled to reorganize his command as soon as covered from the guns of the enemy. To the left our success was decided, but the advantage was lost by the feeble action of Mott. Upton, with his assaulting party, pushed forward and crossed the enemy's intrenchments. Turning to the right and left, he captured several guns and some hundreds of prisoners. Mott was ordered to his assistance, but failed utterly. So much time was lost in trying to get up the troops, which were in the right position to reinforce, that I ordered Upton to withdraw. But the officers and men of his command were so averse to giving up the advantage they had gained that I withdrew the order. To relieve them, I ordered a renewal of the assault. By this time Hancock, who had gone with Birney's division to relieve Barlow, had returned, bringing the division with him. His corps was now joined with Warren's and Wright's in this last assault. It was gallantly made, many men getting up to and over the works of the enemy, but they were not able to hold them. At night they were withdrawn. Upton brought his prisoners with him, but the guns he had captured he was obliged to abandon. Upton had gained an important advantage, but a lack in others of the spirit and dash possessed by him lost it to us. Before leaving Washington I had been authorized to promote officers on the field for special acts of gallantry. By this authority I conferred the rank of brigadier general upon Upton on the spot, and this act was confirmed by the President. Upton had been badly wounded in this fight. Burnside on the left had got up to within a few hundred yards of Spotsylvania Court House, completely turning Lee's right. He was not aware of the importance of the advantage he had gained, and I, being with the troops where the heavy fighting was, did not know of it at the time. He had gained his position with but little fighting and almost without loss. Burnside's position now separated him widely from Wright's corps, the corps nearest to him. At night he was ordered to join on to this. This brought him back about a mile and lost to us an important advantage. I attach no blame to Burnside for this, but I do to myself for not having had a staff officer with him to report to me his position. The enemy had not dared to come out of his line at any point to follow up his advantage, except in the single instance of this attack on Barlow. Then he was twice repulsed with heavy loss, though he had an entire corps against 2 brigades. Barlow took up his bridges in the presence of this force. On the 11th there was no battle, and but little firing, none except by Mott, who made a reconnoissance to ascertain if there was a weak point in the enemy's line. I wrote the following letter to General Halleck: Near Spotsylvania Court House, May 11, 1864, 8:30 A.M. Major General Halleck, Chief of Staff of the Army, Washington, D.C. We have now ended the 6th day of very hard fighting. The result up to this time is much in our favor, but our losses have been heavy as well as those of the enemy. We have lost to this time 11 general officers killed, wounded and missing, and probably 20,000 men. I think the loss of the enemy must be greater, we having taken over 4,000 prisoners in battle, whilst he has taken from us but few, except a few stragglers. I am now sending back to Belle Plain all my wagons for a fresh supply of provisions and ammunition, and propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. The arrival of reinforcements here will be very encouraging to the men, and I hope they will be sent as fast as possible and in as great numbers. My object in having them sent to Belle Plain was to use them as an escort to our supply trains. If it is more convenient to send them out by train to march from the railroad to Belle Plain or Fredericksburg, send them so. I am satisfied the enemy are very shaky, and are only kept up to the mark by the greatest exertions on the part of their officers, and by keeping them entrenched in every position they take. Up to this time there is no indication of any portion of Lee's army being detached for the defense of Richmond. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. And also I received information through the War Department from General Butler that his cavalry under Kautz had cut the railroad south of Petersburg, separating Beauregard from Richmond, and had whipped Hill, killing, wounding and capturing many. Also that he was entrenched and could maintain himself. On this same day came news from Sheridan to the effect that he had destroyed 10 miles of the railroad and telegraph between Lee and Richmond, 1.5 million rations, and most of the medical stores for his army. On the 8th I had directed Sheridan verbally to cut loose from the Army of the Potomac and pass around the left of Lee's army and attack his cavalry and communications, which was successfully executed in the manner I have already described. End of section 52. Recording by Jim Clevenger, Little Rock, Arkansas. Jim at joclev.com.